Hi there, and welcome to the next lesson in the Crime and Deviance module. Today we're going to be looking at functionalism and crime. So there are two main learning objectives for today's lesson. The first one is to explain the functionalist perspective of crime and deviance, and the second one is then going to be asking us to evaluate the usefulness of the functionalist perspective of crime and deviance. So this is going to involve looking at the strengths and weaknesses of their contributions. So as a starter activity, in the green box below, I'd like you to discuss reasons as to why you think crime might be a good thing for society. So what are the benefits of crime? And to stretch you a bit further, the challenge below is asking you to incorporate in your answer key terms like organic analogy or norms and values. Remember, organic analogy is referring to society and the ways in which it functions like a human body. So, for example, in the human body, we've got our lungs, we've got our heart, we've got all the different organs that sort of help our body function effectively. So, thinking about the human body in the same sense as society, what are all the different functions and institutions in society that enable society to function effectively? And could crime be one of them? So just pause me as you write down your answer for this in the green box. So during this lesson, we're going to be looking at the three key thinkers for functionalism and crime and looking at their ideas. So the key thinker number one is Durkheim, who you've all heard of before. And Durkheim believed that crime performs four key functions. And these are social cohesion, safety valve, reaffirming boundaries, and changing values. So we're going to be looking at those in a bit more detail as we work our way through the lesson. The second key thinker is Merton, and he discusses a theory called strain theory, which again we'll be looking at in more detail as we work our way through the lesson. And third and finally is Cohen, and he discusses a theory called status frustration. So let's begin our lesson with looking at key thinker number one, and that is Durkheim. So Durkheim believed that crime in small amounts is necessary for society to function. Durkheim believes that crime is inevitable, as not everyone can be integrated into the norms and values of society. Durkheim argues that each society has a shared set of norms and values that guide our actions. These norms and values tell us what is acceptable and unacceptable behaviour. He argues that crime is normal in all societies. And when people commit crime, it performs four key functions which we need for the healthy functioning of society. These four key functions are social cohesion, safety valve, reaffirming boundaries, and changing values. And we're going to be looking at these in more detail now. So this is the table that I'm going to be asking you to refer back to as we work our way through the lesson. So after we explore each function, you're going to be then referring back to this table and filling in the explanation, providing an example of the explanation, and then definitely going to be criticising it because you're going to need to relying on these criticisms for a task at the end of the lesson. So the first function that Durkheim discusses is how crime creates social cohesion. So when horrific crimes are committed, the community comes together, so society comes together as a whole. People are equally outraged by what has happened and all come together as a society to support each other during the difficult time. So can you think of any examples when a crime has brought people together? So just pause me for a moment as you think about what examples you think you could provide. So an example which you might have thought of is one that happened back in July last year with the death of George Floyd. And his death brought together communities of all different social backgrounds, so all different races, all different genders, all different social class backgrounds, all come together to protest and to fight for black rights. So this is an example of how an horrific crime, such as the death of George Floyd, actually caused the community and society to all come together as a whole and to support one another and to fight together in order to achieve equality for black people. However, do we think that crimes always create social cohesion? Can there ever be instances where crime actually has the opposite effect and perhaps doesn't maybe bring people together as a whole, but causes people to pushes people apart even further. An example that I would like to introduce you to maybe demonstrate this idea of social cohesion not happening is what BBC News identified as the backlash of Black Lives Matter. So there's an article just here, which I've put the link to, which also has a video that goes along with it. And I'd like you to watch the video and read the article to unlock a criticism of this function. So to unlock a criticism of social cohesion happening. You'll see in the article that it's discussed how actually people became quite even more extreme in their potentially racist views as a result of the protests that were happening for Black Lives Matter. And this had a really divisive effect. And it was referred to as a divisive effect similar to that of Brexit. So this is a really good example that gets us thinking about ways in which an event which might, in some aspects, create social cohesion can also have the complete opposite effect. So once you've read that article and watched the video, I'd like you to revisit the table that we looked at on the previous slide to give an overview about what this function is discussing. So what is social cohesion and how does crime enable it? And then to give an example about how crime has actually enabled social cohesion. And then to also fill in the criticism box about how crime and how social cohesion maybe isn't always a possibility. So function number 2 that Durkheim talks about is safety valves. And this is this idea that crime or deviance acts as a pressure release, and deviancy allows individuals to express themselves in ways which is not necessarily criminal. So for example, during the 2012 student protests against the rise in tuition fees, students were given the opportunity to release their stress and anger at the fact the government had increased yet again the cost of university tuition. But they did this in ways which weren't necessarily criminal. Yes, they were acting in deviant ways. They were protesting against what had happened. They weren't acting in particularly socially acceptable ways, but they were nonetheless enabling themselves to sort of let off this steam in a way that wasn't necessarily criminal. And what I always find really helpful to help me understand this notion of safety valve is the film The Purge. If you've seen The Purge, you'll know that in the film, all crime is legal for one night only. So whatever act you commit, you're not necessarily breaking the law. And that's meant to enable society to sort of let off their steam, release a load of anger, so that when society does then turn back to normal, the hope is there'll be less crime committed because people have been given this one opportunity to really release the steam for one night only. So this is function number 2, this idea of crime acts as a safety valve, or deviance act as a safety valve. We're given an opportunity to let off steam without actually acting in a really criminal way. However, the criticism here is releasing pressure solely a positive thing? And Durkheim fails to really define how much pressure is functional for society, and can it go a step too far? And I'm sure you've all heard of Extinction Rebellion, who are a protest group who protest in really extreme ways across the country for things that they advocate. And I've got a little article here for you, and there's also a really interesting YouTube link which in particular shows their protests at Canning Town tube station as a fight against people not being able to travel due to COVID. So this is an example here about how protest, this idea of safety valve, has really been taken too far. So again, if you go back to your table, you look at the safety valve, you write an overview about what it is the safety valve function does according to Durkheim, give an example of this, so you could use the 2012 student protest in your answer, and then you could provide your criticism of this. Okay, so Durkheim doesn't really define how much pressure is functional for society. Can it go too far? And how does Extinction Rebellion maybe give us an example about how this pressure has been taken a step too far and is no longer holding a positive function for society? And the number 3 of Durkheim's 4 functions is this idea of reaffirming boundaries. So reaffirming boundaries looks at how, when the media and public shaming takes place, it's a way of showing society what will happen if laws are broken and people cross these boundaries between non-criminal and criminal behaviour. And as a result, it reminds people that they must abide by the law. So can you think of any examples, and just pause me as you think, of any examples of how the media has sort of done public shaming of people who have committed criminal acts, and how this has maybe reaffirmed our understandings about the boundaries that we can and cannot cross, and then reminds people that they must act in a law-abiding way? What examples can you think of? So one really interesting example that I can think of is the case of a woman called Shamima Begum, and the Sun, posted a news article regarding Shamima Begum, saying arrogant ISIS bride Shamima Begum has a massive ego and shows no remorse for fleeing Britain to join terror group, body language expert says. So here's the newspaper The Sun doing a news report on Shamima Begum, publicly shaming her for joining the ISIS group. And my question to you is, how do you think the shaming of Shamima Begum reinforces the British values against extremism? And how does it reaffirm our understandings about what is acceptable ways of behaving in our society? So can you just pause me as you perhaps write down some of the ideas that you can think of as to why the shaming of Shamima Begum has reinforced these British values against extremism, and at the same time has reaffirmed the boundaries and our understandings of the boundaries that we can and cannot cross. Okay, great. So some things I've put here is by shaming Shamima Begum on public news outlets, it reinforces the fundamental British values which ISIS have gone against. So it reinforces this idea of democracy, of mutual respect, and for tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. And it sort of reminds us that if we don't do these things, if we don't act in line with the fundamental British values in our society, then there's going to be repercussions. If we cross those boundaries, we are going to be, there's that threat of being publicly shamed, and this sort of acts as a way of showing us and reminding us of the law-abiding ways we must all act in line with. So according to Durkheim, when people cross these boundaries, it's a positive thing for society, as it reminds the rest of us of the ways in which we must behave in order to maintain the current social order. And the final function, according to Durkheim, is the changing of values. So every so often when people are taken to court, important questions are raised about the justice system, and these reflect changes in time, values and ideas. So I think the case of Corinja Ahluwalia is a really interesting one here to use to demonstrate this understanding. And she was subjected to 10 years of domestic violence, and it was during her court case that she was able to highlight and raise an understanding that there are actually many different forms of domestic violence. These aren't actually just physical forms of domestic violence, but they actually can incorporate emotional and financial abuse. And it was from these understandings that she sort of raised in court that meant that she was actually able to eventually change the way society viewed domestic violence. I think before her case, it was viewed predominantly as a physical act, but there's actually many different strands of domestic violence which we're now all aware of as a result of the crimes that she was victim to. So according to Durkheim, when these crimes happen, it sort of helps to improve society, and we can build on what we already know in order to create a more just, fair society. And here are some evaluative points which would help you inform your criticism boxes in the table that I'm sure you've now nearly completed. So is Durkheim's view too simplistic? So does he fail to see the negatives of crime? So what about the victims of crime? So for example, although Corinja Ahluwalia's case managed to change values and improve society as a whole, she still suffered a great deal of hardship. So Durkheim does not really seem to account for this. And does crime always benefit society? So, for example, looking at things such as extremism and Extinction Rebellion. So now we're on to key thinker number 2, and that's Merton with his strain theory. So Merton believed that crime is a result of the poor feeling strained as they are unable to acquire the desired material goods in society through socially acceptable means, so for example through education. If this occurs, Merton argues that individuals will seek non-legitimate means to secure these goals, putting society in a state of anomie. Remember, anomie means this idea of chaos, normlessness. So if individuals cannot secure these material goals in society through socially acceptable means, such as going to school and getting an education and earning money, they'll then seek to achieve these means through maybe illegitimate ways. So maybe things such as crime, such as deviance. And when this happens, society is put in a state of anomie. So society sets these goals, socially approved goals, way of achieving these goals are not possible, and as a result, people turn to criminal, deviant means of achieving these goals. And this image down here is actually an image of London riots. Okay, so London riots is a great example of anomie taking place. And Merton argues that there are 5 possible ways in which individuals could respond to the goals set by society, so these material goals of wealth and nice houses and nice cars. Merton argues there are 5 ways people could respond to these goals. And these 5 ways are conformity, innovation, ritualism, retreatism, and rebellion. And of course, you'll see there are 5 definitions that belong to one of these 5 possible ways individuals could respond. So your task is to come to this table and to read all the definitions and decide which one belongs where. So write in the correct definition to the word here in the box, and in the example box write an example of this reason in action and think about how we can then criticize this. So I've done the first one for you. And I've said that conformity is when individuals who work towards achieving their goals through socially acceptable means, such as gain qualifications and hard work. That's what conformity is. My example is that when individuals who want a fancy car and a house, they work hard in school, they go to university and get qualifications so that they can then afford these things. My criticism is that conformity isn't always an option in society. Some people suffer from material deprivation, and therefore they simply cannot afford an education. So I'd like you now to do the same for innovation, ritualism, retreatism and rebellion, providing the correct definition for each and then an example for each, along with a criticism for each. You'll see I've done retreatism for you, I've also done the criticism, so you would just have to give your own example. So just pause me as you work your way through that. And then here I would like you to apply strain theory to 2 questions. And these aren't exam questions, but these are questions that sort of get you thinking in a way in which would be beneficial in answering exam style questions. So the first one's asking you why the working class might feel more strained in today's society. And the second one is asking you how we could use strain theory to explain why working class commit more crime than the middle class. So again, just pause me as you work your way through these 2 questions. And now we're on to number 3, so our final key thinker, and that's Cohen and his theory on status frustration. So Cohen argues that individuals seek illegitimate opportunity structures to achieve status in their lives. And he argues that working class boys try to gain status within school and fail, and therefore they suffer from status frustration. Sometimes these boys find each other and form subcultures. It is then when status is formed within this subculture by breaking the mainstream rules. These boys develop their own norms and their own values. This might include vandalism or violence as being praiseworthy and a source of status within the group. So Cohen argues this idea that individuals seek illegitimate opportunity structures as a means of achieving status when legitimate opportunity structures are not available. And here we have got a column for legitimate opportunity structures and a column for illegitimate opportunity structures. And your task here would be to read each of these different opportunity structures and sort them into either illegitimate or legitimate. So for example, having 100% attendance at school would for sure belong in the legitimate opportunity structure, as it's a way for you to gain status and a sense of feeling good about yourself through legitimate means such as education. So work your way through all of these different structures and decide if they belong under legitimate or illegitimate. And just pause me as you do this. Okay, great, well done. So here are some criticisms of the functionalist view of crime. This idea that crime is not always functional for individuals, particularly the victims of the crime. So looking again at this case of Karinja Aluwalia and what she went through in order for changes to be made in society. Functionalists did not tell us how much crime is the right amount of crime. So this idea of focusing on the Extinction Rebellion example we gave earlier. And most of the ideas that functionalists focus on are working class criminality, and they fail to properly explain middle class crimes such as corporate crime and fraud, which is something we're going to be looking at in a bit more detail in a few lessons' time. So I'd like you to rank these criticisms in order. The one that you think is best, so the most convincing, will be number 1, 2, and 3 for the least convincing. Just write the numbers next to them. And then, as usual, guys, we have got 2 exam practice questions for you here. And the first one is asking you to identify and explain one function of crime that Durkheim identified. And the final bit of this one is asking you to provide a criticism for it. Okay? So you have to go back to the table that you've already completed for that and write your answer using that table to help you. Any questions, please do just email me. Thank you and goodbye.